I swear, if my baby dies because of some HOA witch tossing her oxygen, I'll make sure the next time she sees a tankets from a prison med bay. That was the first thought that ripped through my brain as I watched Ellie, my 9-month-old daughter, gasping for breath while paramedics scrambled around her with sirens still wailing outside. And all of this, every second of this nightmare, was because of one woman, Karen. The HOA president with a clipboard full of fake rules and a head full of nonsense about neighborhood aesthetics. What she didn't know, though, was that she had just declared war on the wrong man. Because I'm not just some homeowner with a sick baby. I'm the state health inspector. And her reign of terror was about to suffocate for good. The morning had started off deceptively calm. The skies were clear, the air was crisp, and I had just finished connecting Ellie's portable oxygen unit on the front porch. We were getting some HVAC work done in the house, and it required temporary disconnection of her usual system for a few hours. The porch was the safest spot, cool shade, easy visibility, and a short distance from the backup tank, which I had carefully placed in a sealed container marked, "Medical use only, do not touch." I even added a laminated sign with a biohazard warning just for extra caution. Ellie was inside, resting peacefully with her baby monitor blinking green. Then came the Karen sighting. I spotted her in my peripheral vision, walking her usual HOA inspection route like she was patrolling a maximum security facility. She wore her signature floral sun hat and those massive bug-eye sunglasses that made her look like a discount Bond villain. Her clipboard was tucked under her arm like it contained the secrets of the universe. She paused in front of my porch, looked directly at the tank, then squinted at the medical sign like it had personally offended her. I stepped out and gave her a polite nod. "Morning, Karen. It's just a backup oxygen tank for Ellie. We're having some repairs done inside." She didn't even blink. "That's not approved. It's visible from the street. It's temporary. Should only be here a few hours," I said, keeping my tone level. I knew how these things went with Karen. If you gave her a hint of frustration, she'd take it as fuel for a fine. She pulled her clipboard out, scribbled something furiously, and muttered, "Violates the Community Visual Harmony Code. I'll give you a verbal warning for now." My jaw twitched. "Karen, this is for my daughter's breathing. She's medically fragile. You can't just—" "I don't need a lecture on parenting from someone who decorates with hazardous materials," she snapped, then turned on her heel and walked off like she'd just settled a court case. I stood there stunned, then shook my head. I had to pick up Ellie's prescription from the pharmacy, and with the tank locked and sealed, I figured we were fine. My wife was at the hospital for a late shift, so I kissed Ellie gently, gave the baby monitor one last check, and headed out. 25 minutes. That's how long I was gone. 25 damn minutes. When I came back, the tank was gone. Gone. The spot where it sat was completely empty, and for a second I thought maybe the wind had knocked it over, but that was impossible. It had been strapped down. My stomach sank. I rushed to the porch camera and rewound the footage. There she was, Karen. Gloves on, struggling to lift the tank, muttering, "This eyesore is going," as she dragged it toward the street. I bolted to the HOA dumpster. The lid was open, and there it was, tipped sideways, half crushed, with the warning labels facing upward like a silent scream. That's when I heard it, the baby monitor alert. One long beep, then another. Red light. Panic took over as I sprinted into the house, scooped Ellie up, and saw her chest struggling to rise. Her lips were turning a faint blue. I grabbed the emergency call phone, dialed 911 with shaking hands, and the words I shouted into the phone felt like I was choking on them. "My daughter can't breathe. Her oxygen tank was taken. She's not breathing right." The paramedics arrived in under 5 minutes. They set up a temporary mask and carried her to the ambulance as I rode with them, holding her tiny fingers in mine and watching the color slowly return to her face. At the ER, she stabilized, thank God. But I didn't. I couldn't. When I returned home late that night, the security footage was playing on repeat in my mind. Karen, with her smug little mission, throwing away a child's lifeline like it was trash. I walked past her house. Lights were on. Her TV was glowing behind the curtain. She probably felt proud. Maybe even justified. I stood on my porch, staring at the street lamp reflecting off the dumpster metal. My hand shook with the weight of it all. Then I remembered who I was. I wasn't just Ellie's dad. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was the one person in this entire state legally empowered to shut down health code violations. I inspect hospitals, rehab centers, clinics. I've busted corrupt directors and fined millionaire administrators for cutting corners. And Karen? Karen had just turned her petty rulebook into a felony-level offense. She had interfered with life-sustaining medical equipment. For a child. On camera. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Because tomorrow I was going to start filing paperwork. Not just any paperwork. The kind of paperwork that gets doors kicked in. The kind that sends boards into emergency sessions. The kind that turns HOA meetings into war zones. Karen was about to learn that some rules weren't made to be bent, and some tanks weren't meant to be tossed. Especially not when they belonged to the child of a man who knew every health code in the book and had the power to make her regret every smug second of her little sidewalk victory. Tomorrow, the real inspection would begin. The next morning arrived with an eerie calm that felt completely wrong, like the air itself knew something big was coming. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, Ellie napping soundly in her crib upstairs, still on oxygen but stable again. My hands moved with precision, opening folders, compiling screenshots, downloading video clips, and organizing state-level health and housing documents. Years of inspecting hospital violations had sharpened my sense of how to build a case, and this time, I wasn't auditing a shady clinic or an understaffed rehab center. I was going after the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac. Karen had no idea what kind of hornet's nest she had kicked. First, I needed to understand exactly how she had gotten away with this in the first place. The HOA bylaws were supposed to be publicly accessible, but when I visited the community website, all I found was a homepage with an outdated phone number, a stock photo of a smiling family that looked like it came from the early 2000s, and a PDF labeled Community Standards. I downloaded it, expecting to see something vaguely resembling legality. Instead, I found the most passive-aggressive rulebook ever created. Fonts changed every paragraph. There were entire pages about flower pot placement and lawn gnome colors. But nothing, absolutely nothing, about oxygen tanks, medical equipment, or visual health accommodations. This meant Karen either fabricated a rule or manipulated a vague one to serve her own agenda. I knew the Fair Housing Act. I knew the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I knew that tossing a medical device wasn't just a moral failure, it was a legal grenade. That gave me my first opening. I started making calls. First to the ADA Compliance Board, then to a contact I had at HUD. I wasn't just some angry dad ranting on Facebook. I was a licensed state health inspector flagging a potential civil rights violation involving the endangerment of a disabled infant. Within the hour, I had 2 case files opened and official interest brewing. But I wasn't done. Next, I needed to understand Karen's grip on the neighborhood. I wasn't the only one she'd targeted, and I suspected if I pulled at the thread long enough, the entire HOA might unravel. So I went door to door, but not in an aggressive way. I waited until people were getting their mail, taking their trash out, walking their dogs. I introduced myself politely, mentioned what had happened to Ellie in calm tones, and asked if anyone else had been on the receiving end of Karen's creativity. What I got was a flood. An elderly couple who said Karen once fined them for having a bench that looked too rustic. A single mom who admitted through teary eyes that her autistic son had his therapeutic sand table removed from the front yard by Karen herself because it was messy. A Vietnam veteran who told me Karen had reported him for excessive flag flying during Memorial Day. Each of them seemed to carry this invisible weight, a combination of frustration, fear and resignation. They didn't think anyone could stop her. Most had tried to push back in small ways, but Karen would retaliate with late fee notices, threats of lien placements, or community-shaming emails. One story hit particularly hard. A woman down the street, named Julia, told me that her husband had stage 4 lung cancer last year. They had a home oxygen concentrator and occasionally had to leave backup tanks outside during tank delivery transitions. She showed me a photo on her phone of a tank with a handwritten note from Karen taped to it. "This is not a hospital. Please maintain visual consistency with the neighborhood." Julia's husband had passed away 3 months after that. I didn't ask if the note had anything to do with it, but the pain in her eyes said enough. I began gathering these accounts one by one, documenting everything. Names, addresses, dates, emails, photos, videos. I created a separate folder labeled Witness Statements, and before I knew it, it had 20 entries. All of them painted the same picture. Karen was running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and the HOA board was either asleep or in her pocket. I needed to test their legitimacy. I reviewed the board composition, sent a formal records request using my legal authority, and what I got back was laughable. Only 2 out of 5 board members were properly registered. The rest were either appointed by Karen or hadn't attended a meeting in over 6 months. Even worse, I uncovered something shady. Karen had printed and distributed a rule titled Emergency Storage Ban, which claimed to prohibit any visible storage of medical or mechanical equipment outdoors. It wasn't listed in the original community bylaws. I pulled the metadata from the PDF she had emailed to residents months ago. It had been created from her personal computer. Her name was right there in the Properties tab, alongside the creation date. This rule had never been voted on, never reviewed, never logged in meeting note. She had fabricated an entire policy just to target whatever annoyed her. Now I had her not just for endangering my daughter, but for fraudulently altering HOA documents. That opened her up to criminal scrutiny. It was time for the next step, bait. I coordinated with a neighbor I trusted, Mr. Clarkson, a retired electrical engineer whose wife used a CPAP machine. He agreed to place a large, clearly marked oxygen tank on his patio in a fake medical use case, same as I had. We installed a hidden camera with audio, mounted under the gutter just overhead. Sure enough, within 2 days, Karen came marching down the street with her gloves, clipboard, and attitude. She didn't knock. She didn't call. She didn't leave a note. She simply walked up, grunted with annoyance, and began dragging the tank toward the curb. "Not again," she muttered to herself. "You people think this is a hospital ward? It's not." Then she glanced around, not noticing the lens above her, and spat, "This neighborhood's for people who belong here." And just like that, she sealed her fate. I clipped the footage, labeled it Exhibit C, and added it to my growing case folder. Between the witness statements, the fabricated document trail, the security footage, and the ADA violations, I had enough to put Karen under enough legal fire to melt her sun hat. But I didn't want to act prematurely. I wanted one more move, to see how deep her reach really went. I called for a neighborhood meeting. Informal at first. I handed out flyers that said, "Concerned Resident Gathering, Discussion on HOA Abuse." Within 24 hours, 22 residents confirmed. We met in Mr. Clarkson's backyard, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something change. These weren't just annoyed homeowners anymore. They were fired up. They were done being bullied by a woman who believed her clipboard was law. Karen thought she was the sheriff of this town. But what she didn't realize was, I had already called the real cavalry. And very soon, the HOA wasn't going to be hers to rule, it was going to be the scene of her downfall. The day of the inspection arrived without fanfare, but it hit the HOA office like a storm that had been quietly brewing. I'd filed the formal health code complaints under my official capacity, cross-referenced the ADA and fair housing violations, and coordinated the timing with state officials so it couldn't be quietly swept under the rug. By mid-morning, 3 separate agencies pulled up, vehicles marked with state seals, clipboard-wielding inspectors stepping out with calm determination. I didn't lead them. I simply watched from the sidewalk as they approached the HOA's temporary office space in the community clubhouse, where Karen had once proudly hosted her ridiculous, patriotic HOA picnic that banned any flag over 2 by 3 feet. I sipped my coffee and waited. Karen must have gotten a call or seen them from her window, because not 10 minutes later she came stomping down the sidewalk in a pair of bright pink clogs and a matching blouse that screamed desperation. Her sunglasses were perched on her head like a crown, and the way she swung her arms made it look like she was ready to accuse someone of theft. She reached the inspectors just as one was opening the door to the clubhouse and began demanding explanations. I couldn't hear everything, but I recognized the hand flailing, the puffed chest, the shrill tone that rose like steam from a kettle about to blow. The inspectors didn't flinch. They calmly produced documents and began their walkthrough. Karen stood frozen for a moment, stunned by her lack of control, and then turned and glared at me like she'd just figured out who to blame. That glare didn't scare me. If anything, it confirmed that everything I'd done was working. I waved politely and went back to reviewing the updated HOA member list. 2 inspectors stayed behind while the others walked the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, measuring sidewalk ramps, checking access signs, and snapping photos of community features that lacked ADA compliance. There was no accessible entry to the clubhouse, and the only ramp available was too steep to pass regulation. Karen had always claimed that any member with disabilities could just ask for help, like that was a suitable replacement for infrastructure. The team found this out quickly. By noon, Karen was pacing on her lawn, phone glued to her ear, visibly sweating despite the mild weather. She had tried to reach the board, but her 2 absentee allies didn't return her calls, and the other members had already distanced themselves. One even showed up at my door the day before the inspection and said quietly, "I never agreed with her. I just didn't want to be her next target." I didn't blame him. But I didn't trust him either. The HOA residents were watching from their windows, their porches, their cars. News spread fast, faster than anything Karen had ever posted on her HOA bulletin board. By afternoon, word reached a local journalist who had written pieces on community overreach and housing discrimination. She called me for a statement. I gave her the facts, the documents, the footage, and the full breakdown of how the HOA president had fabricated rules, enforced fake laws, and physically endangered a disabled child. She told me she'd be writing an article under the title, "When Power Goes to the Clipboard." The next escalation came during the impromptu town hall that evening. Enough residents had heard what happened during the inspection that they demanded answers. The HOA bylaws allowed for an emergency board meeting if called by more than 15% of the community, and that threshold was easily met. Flyers went out, people gathered in the clubhouse yard, and I was asked, by popular demand, to speak. I didn't want to come off as vengeful or theatrical, but I needed to show them exactly what Karen had done, and why it wasn't just about Ellie's oxygen tank. I stood before the crowd with a laptop and portable speaker. I showed the footage of Karen taking the tank. Audible gasps followed. I played the audio of her muttering about people who belong here. Faces changed. Then I explained how she had faked rules, bullied disabled residents, and manipulated community funds without proper oversight. I detailed the ADA violations and the pending charges. I kept it clear, concise, and irrefutable. Karen arrived halfway through, flanked by 2 friends who looked like they regretted showing up. She tried to shout over me, demanding I stop, calling me a liar, accusing me of manufacturing drama. But someone in the crowd shouted back, "You threw away a baby's oxygen tank. Sit down." That was the turning point. She shrank back but didn't leave. She stood there while the board was asked to vote on her suspension. 1 member abstained, but the others voted yes. Karen was stripped of her authority pending legal investigation. I thought that might satisfy me, but it didn't. Not fully. Because the next day, Karen filed a restraining order against me. She claimed harassment, intimidation, and slander. She said I was a disgruntled homeowner with a vendetta, and that she feared for her safety. She left out the part about endangering my child. I got the court summons and showed up ready, evidence files tucked under my arm, 3 witnesses in tow. The judge barely looked up as Karen launched into a dramatic speech about her years of service to the neighborhood and how I had turned everyone against her. When it was my turn, I placed a printed photograph of Ellie's medical equipment on the judge's desk, followed by the security footage, the fabricated HOA rule metadata, and the documentation of my official complaint from the state office. I read out the text Karen sent to a neighbor the week before that said, "I don't care if it's a baby or a dog, these people are ruining the street with their clutter." The courtroom was silent. Karen stared at the floor. The judge dismissed her petition immediately, saying it was a waste of the court's time and warning her about abuse of the legal system. I turned to leave without looking back, but I heard her whisper under her breath, "This isn't over." She was right. It wasn't over, because now the state was involved. The media was watching, and the neighborhood, finally awake, had stopped whispering and started roaring. Karen had made herself the symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power. And I was going to make sure that every board, every HOA, every clipboard dictator like her saw what happened when they crossed the line, especially when that line was drawn by a state health inspector with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The fallout from the inspection and the emergency board meeting didn't just linger in the air, it exploded. The very next week, a formal letter arrived from the state attorney general's office addressed to both the HOA board and Karen individually. It confirmed that a state-level investigation had been opened into allegations of civil rights violations, misuse of HOA authority, and potential fraud relating to falsified documents and funds. The tone was calm, sterile, and devastating. Karen, once so smug and untouchable, now faced more than just neighborhood backlash. She was staring down state auditors, civil litigation, and possibly even criminal charges. But none of that was enough until accountability became public. She had endangered Ellie's life and emotionally wrecked my family. No amount of board meetings or suspensions could right that without exposure. So I filed the lawsuit. It wasn't just about Ellie anymore. It was about every resident who had been silenced, fined, or humiliated by a woman who used a clipboard like a weapon. I sued the HOA for ADA discrimination, negligence, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Karen was named as a co-defendant. The moment that court papers were served at her door, I got a call. Not from Karen, of course, she wouldn't lower herself, but from a panic-sounding attorney representing the HOA, trying to resolve this civilly. I listened calmly as he made the standard offer: a monetary settlement, confidentiality clause, and dismissal of all claims. He even sounded hopeful, like I'd be grateful for the olive branch. I told him it wasn't about money. I told him it was about change, truth, and making sure the next Karen didn't feel so safe swinging around fake rules and punishing people who needed help. Then I laid out my condition. Karen would issue a public apology in person at the next HOA meeting. Not in an email. Not in a private letter. Public. Face to face. Otherwise, I'd take this lawsuit all the way and drag every dirty HOA policy into the daylight where it belonged. The attorney hesitated, then said he'd call me back. Karen, of course, refused. No apology. No public humiliation. Her ego wouldn't allow it. That was the moment everything shifted. The case went from a legal battle to a public spectacle. The journalist who had originally covered the inspection published a follow-up article with the headline, "HOA President Tossed Medical Equipment, Then Sued for It." The story went viral. Local news picked it up. Then regional. Suddenly I was receiving interview requests, letters of support, even offers from advocacy groups asking if I wanted to partner on legislation for HOA reform. It was surreal. Meanwhile, Karen's world was shrinking fast. Her social circle dried up almost overnight. The neighbors who once tolerated her out of fear now avoided her entirely. She would walk the sidewalks like a ghost, sunglasses on, lips tight, pretending the whispers didn't exist. But they did. They followed her everywhere. The moms at the playground who used to nod politely now stared daggers. Even the local hardware store clerk wouldn't make eye contact. She'd gone from queen of the neighborhood to its most avoided pariah. At the same time, the HOA board began to fracture. Internal emails leaked, board members turning on each other, blaming Karen for dragging them into legal disaster. One even resigned mid-email, citing stress and moral disgust. The HOA's insurance policy was triggered to cover legal fees, but that only added fuel to the fire. The premiums spiked. Special assessments were proposed to cover costs. The residents, already furious, now faced financial penalties for the actions of a leader most of them had never elected in the first place. That brought us to the court date. I arrived with my wife, holding Ellie gently in my arms. She wore a tiny mask over her nose and a soft white beanie. She was healthy, alert, and curious, completely unaware that the courtroom she entered would be the place her story began changing lives. Karen was already seated with her lawyer, looking stiff and drawn. Her face was pale, and her lips pressed into a line so tight it almost disappeared. She didn't look at us once. Not even when Ellie coughed. The judge was seasoned, no nonsense, and uninterested in theatrics. Opening statements were short. Karen's attorney tried to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment. He used phrases like administrative oversight and unintentional policy misapplication. I kept my face expressionless, but inside I was seething. They were trying to make this about paperwork, about procedure, not about a baby gasping for air because a woman with a grudge didn't like how a tank looked. When it was my turn, I stood and laid it out plainly. I told the court what Ellie's condition was. I described what it meant to live every day on alert for medical emergencies, to keep logs, machines, and backups for everything. I told them what it was like to come home and find the lifeline I left for my child had been stolen, not by a thief in the night, but by a neighbor who thought her neighborhood's image mattered more than a human life. I showed them the footage. I read the forged policy metadata aloud. I played the audio of Karen muttering about people who belong. Every word landed like a weight on the room. You could feel it. Even the clerk stopped typing. Karen didn't speak. Not a word. When the judge offered her a chance to address the court, she simply shook her head. Her lawyer declined on her behalf. That was the final nail. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They returned with a unanimous verdict, in favor of the plaintiff, me, and Ellie. Damages awarded, $1.2 million. Half to be paid by the HOA, half by Karen directly. The judge also imposed an injunction. Karen was permanently barred from holding any HOA office in the state again. The courthouse steps were crowded when we walked out. News crews, residents, supporters. I didn't stop for interviews. I didn't make a speech. I just looked at Ellie, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "We did it, baby girl." But what stayed with me most wasn't the money, or the ruling, or even the cameras. It was the look in Karen's eyes as the verdict was read. Not rage, not shock, just emptiness, like the weight of what she'd done had finally caught up. And the thing was, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved. Not because I'd won, but because she had finally been stopped. For Ellie. For the other residents. For every person who ever got a note on their door saying they didn't belong. 1 year later, the neighborhood looked the same on the surface. Same trimmed hedges, same carefully spaced mailboxes, same families walking dogs in the evening and kids riding bikes down the cul-de-sac. But everything underneath had changed. Karen's name was now little more than a whispered warning, a symbol of what could happen when power is left unchecked and decency is treated like an obstacle. The HOA had gone through a full overhaul. The board was rebuilt from scratch, this time with real elections and open meetings, and new rules ensured transparency, medical accommodations, and oversight by third-party compliance officers. But more than that, there was a shift in the air. People had stopped being afraid. They talked openly. They helped each other. They looked out for the vulnerable instead of fining them. Karen moved out a few months after the trial. There was no ceremony, no goodbye party, no farewell baked goods. Her house went up for sale quietly, with a simple listing that offered a peaceful home in a beautiful community. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Her car disappeared from the driveway one day, a moving truck rolled in, and just like that, she was gone. Rumor had it she relocated to another state, but no one really cared. She had left behind something more powerful than a vacancy. She had left behind a lesson. For me and my family, life found a new kind of normal. Ellie's health improved slowly, steadily. Her lungs got stronger. The oxygen tank became a thing of the past, eventually replaced by lighter equipment and shorter usage periods. She learned to crawl, then walk, and by the time her second birthday rolled around, she was running laps around the kitchen island with her little toy stethoscope bouncing on her neck, mimicking her pediatrician with serious expressions and pretend diagnoses for her stuffed animals. The child who once needed machines just to breathe now sang to birds and bossed around teddy bears with the confidence of a girl who'd already faced down something big and scary and come out stronger for it. My wife and I made a habit of attending every HOA meeting, not out of paranoia, but because we understood the importance of staying involved. We weren't the only ones. Attendance doubled, then tripled. Residents who had never cared before started showing up and speaking up. There was a kind of community awakening, like everyone finally understood what could happen if they didn't pay attention to who was making decisions in their name. We even hosted a town barbecue one weekend, and for the first time since we moved in, the neighborhood felt like a real village. Kids laughing, grown-ups swapping stories, music playing, no passive-aggressive glances or clipboard threats looming in the background. Then something happened that I didn't expect. I got a letter. It came in the mail, no return address, just my name written in careful, cursive script. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a photo. The paper was a handwritten note from a woman named Teresa who lived 3 towns over. She wrote that she had read our story in the local paper, then again online, and she wanted to thank us. Her daughter was wheelchair-bound, and they had been denied permission to install a front porch ramp by their HOA, citing aesthetic disruption. Inspired by our case, Teresa had filed a complaint, partnered with a disability rights group, and eventually forced her own HOA to revise its rules. The photo she included showed her daughter smiling on the ramp, hands raised in triumph. The note ended with a simple line: "You didn't just help your daughter. You helped mine too." I stared at that photo for a long time. Not out of pride, but out of a kind of humbled awe. Because the truth is, when it all started, I wasn't trying to change the world. I just wanted my daughter to breathe. I just wanted to keep her safe. But sometimes, standing up for one small truth creates waves that go further than you ever intended. And Karen, for all the damage she caused, for all the cruelty she wielded under the mask of community rules, had unintentionally lit a fire that refused to burn out. In the months that followed, I was invited to speak at local councils and HOA training seminars. I shared what happened not as a cautionary tale about one bad actor, but as a case study in what happens when people forget the difference between order and control, between leadership and tyranny. I made sure to emphasize the need for empathy in policy, for legal oversight, and for standing up when something feels wrong, even if it's just a neighbor with a clipboard and a mean attitude. Especially then. Eventually, the lawsuit money came through. We didn't use it to move or buy something flashy. We set aside a fund for Ellie's medical and college future, donated a portion to an ADA advocacy group, and invested the rest in quiet, meaningful ways. The real wealth, though, was peace. Peace in knowing that my daughter's life wasn't something people could casually disregard anymore. Peace in knowing that this community had become safer, not just for us, but for everyone. and peace in knowing that Karen's way of running things had been dismantled, not with rage or revenge, but with truth and law. Every now and then, I take a walk down the same sidewalk where I once saw Karen dragging away my daughter's oxygen tank like it was lawn trash. I stand by the curb and remember how powerless I felt in that moment, how furious and helpless. And then I look at the house across the street, the one where a new family lives now, a young couple with a newborn baby of their own, and I smile. Because I know that if they ever need help, if they ever find themselves in trouble, this neighborhood will stand with them. Because it stood with us. Sometimes justice doesn't look like a courtroom or a settlement check. Sometimes it looks like a little girl laughing in the sunshine, a ramp built without a fight, a community that wakes up, and a neighborhood that learns how to breathe again. And sometimes justice looks like silence, like the absence of fear, the absence of power trips, the absence of someone who thought rules gave her the right to play God. Karen thought throwing away a tank was just removing clutter. What she didn't realize was that she tossed away the one thing I was willing to risk everything to defend. My daughter's breath. And for that, she lost everything. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to let her think she could get away with it. Not in my home. Not on my street. Not ever again.